Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We have a great session lined up for you today. Before we get started, there are just a few general housekeeping points to cover. First and foremost, please use the online question tool to post any questions that you have, and we will share them with our speakers. Second, if you experience any technical difficulties today, please use the same questions tool, and a member of our admin team will be on hand to support you. And finally, just to note, this session is being recorded, and we'll be sharing a copy of the recording with you via email in the coming days. So, without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to our speakers to get us started.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for attending our masterclass on the new obligations under the amended New York Department of Financial Services Cybersecurity Regulations. My name is Shea Leitch, and together with my colleagues, we are from the Squire Patton Boggs Data Privacy, Cybersecurity, and Data Compliance Practice Group. We're a global team that advises clients with respect to all kinds of technology and data-related challenges and issues, from cutting-edge transactions, regulatory and policy compliance, cybersecurity, and privacy compliance. We're ranked elite among the world's data protection and cybersecurity firms, and we advise clients on everything data protection and cybersecurity related. So with that, just a point of housekeeping here. The information provided in this presentation is not legal advice, however, and is not intended to constitute legal advice. Instead, this information is for information purposes only, and the content in this presentation are for general knowledge and informational purposes. Next slide, please. Today, we will share with you a little bit about the current New York Department of Financial Services Cybersecurity Regulations, what is new and material with respect to the amendments, and what impact that might have on you and your organization. And then we'll provide some helpful tips with respect to how you can get your organization ready for the new compliance requirements. So before we go a little bit further, I want to introduce myself and my colleagues. My name is Shea Leitch. I am of counsel in Squire Patton Boggs' Washington, D.C. office. My practice focuses on proactive privacy and cybersecurity counseling for clients in all industries and sectors. And now I'll hand you off to my colleague Ericka to introduce herself.
Well, good morning, good afternoon to all of our friends here on the call and the webinar here today. My name is Ericka Johnson, and my practice really specializes in helping our clients respond to cybersecurity incidences of all shapes and sizes and in all jurisdictions. A little bit about my background: I spent 7 years in the Marine Corps doing cyber operations. I'm about year 12 now with reserves, and this is something I'm just very passionate about, and I'm really excited to share with you today really the regulatory changes that we're seeing as it relates to incident response. Glenn, kick it over to you.
Thanks. My name is Glenn Brown. I'm a principal in our firm's Atlanta office, and my practice is focused on data privacy counseling on issues that are of most relevance to organizations in the financial services industry, sort of understood broadly. Next slide, please. So we appreciate the opportunity to be with you today and to discuss some important new developments that will have an impact on all organizations regulated by the New York DFS, Department of Financial Services, also on organizations that are service providers to a regulated entity. As you're probably aware, because you signed up for this program, the New York DFS has proposed some significant amendments to regulations that it had previously promulgated that mandate certain security practices that are designed to prevent unauthorized access and impermissible use of a regulated entity's information systems and sensitive data that it may be maintaining. And so we want to just go over those with you briefly. Again, we're going to assume some familiarity with the subject matter as it's fairly focused. But I do want to just, again, highlight the fact that the New York Department of Financial Services is a state agency responsible for regulating financial services and products, understood broadly. So including those, that are subject to insurance, banking, and financial services laws and regulations. The New York Department of Financial Services has the authority, among other things, to issue and enforce, and it enforces it quite actively, regulations imposing cybersecurity requirements on covered entities. The DFS has not just been active, though, in enforcing its cybersecurity regulations, although it has been, but it also provides guidance to covered entities. It published guidance regarding ransomware incidents back in June of 2021, and it's provided guidance on the use of multi-factor authentication in December of 2021. So it's not all the enforcement activity that's noteworthy. They do a good job of also providing guidance to entities subject to their jurisdiction. Next slide, please. So, how did we get here and where are we in the amendment process? So, as I mentioned, back in 2017, the DFS promulgated the new cybersecurity regulations, and after a lengthy, public comment process. And in November of last year, they published some proposed amendments to the cybersecurity regulations to bring them into alignment with current practices and current requirements that were being considered by other regulators. These amendments were informed by, again, developments in the area from other regulators, but also they represent the DFS's experience with enforcement activity, and so we're informed by what they saw as weaknesses that they identified in those enforcement actions. Shea will discuss those in a little more detail in a moment. So in November 22, they published a proposed amendment, and then just less than a month ago, they published additional proposed amendments, so tweaking the proposed set of amendments that came out in November. They came out with, I'd say, fairly significantly revised amendments. We're not gonna talk about the differences between the November version and the June version, just because we are where we are at this point. We are gonna talk about just the most current version that's being proposed. It's interesting, when we planned this event, we thought that it was likely that the regulations, the amendments to the regulations, were going to be in effect in the next month or so. But this new version that just came out in June is sort of pushed that back, and now we expect them to be finally adopted by the end of the year. But if you haven't already done so, we'd recommend that you take a look at the proposed amendments. There is a public comment period that expires on August 14th. And your organization or an industry trade group may want to consider commenting on the proposed draft. Next slide, please. So it's important to know that this rulemaking isn't occurring in a vacuum. I mean, the DFS, as active and engaged as they've been, is kind of the one thread in the larger dynamic of paying more attention to cybersecurity issues. So I'm quite confident that most, if not all, of the attendees today are also having to, or have had to, take into account significant amendments to the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act safeguards rule that went into effect last month. Just yesterday, the SEC adopted final rules requiring registrants to disclose material cybersecurity events that they experience, on a periodic basis, on Form 8K, and to disclose on an annual basis or quarterly basis material information regarding their cybersecurity risk management strategy and governance and developments in previously disclosed cybersecurity events. So you may not have seen that or may not have had a chance to review that, but if you work for a public entity, you probably want to take a look at that. The SEC has also continued its aggressive push to regulate the cybersecurity of entities in the financial services sector, proposing rules affecting a variety of SEC-regulated entities, including broker-dealers, investment advisors, and investment companies. The EU has recently adopted Directive 2022/2555, typically referred to as NIS2, which strengthens cybersecurity requirements for a diverse range of organizations that operate in the EU, including financial services firms. And there in the EU, each member state is required to implement laws to give effect to NIS2 by October 17th, 2024. And then you've got the Cybersecurity Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act. Critical infrastructure sectors were defined in a 2013 presidential policy directive by President Obama, and they include, as you'd expect, financial services firms. Regulations under that act are forthcoming. And then finally, you've got, for banks and services providers, you've got DIC and Fed and OCC's computer security incident notification requirements. These requirements spell out data incident reporting requirements that all banks and service providers have to adhere to. So this this New York DFS rulemaking activity is one important facet, but just one facet of the overall cybersecurity environment in which organizations are having to operate. Shea? Next slide, please. Sorry.
Next slide, please. So we'll just touch on this briefly because you probably already know who this regulates. Maybe many of you are from New York Department of Financial Services regulated entities. Excuse me.
It always happens at the worst time, right? It's all happened to us.
Apologies. But the New York Department of Financial Services regulates entities, all types of financial entities that operate or offer services to individuals in New York. So this could be banks and trust companies, mortgage lenders, other entities in the mortgage industry, investment companies, insurance companies, savings banks, etc. Next slide, please. The current cybersecurity regulations as they exist take the more prescriptive approach to cybersecurity regulations. So as you may know, some privacy or cybersecurity laws simply require something along the lines of reasonableness in their approach. And so they permit you to kind of choose your adventure with respect to your cybersecurity program. Whereas the DFS rules requires very specific security controls. Now you can tailor those controls to your organization's particular size and complexity, but specific controls are required under the DFS. These are things like you have to have a cybersecurity policy and procedures under that policy to govern how your organization will manage cybersecurity. You are required to have particular governance structure in place. in particular, your, excuse me, everybody. Apologies. Your board of directors, or now what they're going to call your senior governing body, is going to have oversight of your cybersecurity program, and you are obligated to have a CISO. Cybersecurity personnel are obligated to receive training with respect to your cybersecurity program and things like that. So there are detailed requirements with respect to what personnel are responsible for with respect to your cybersecurity organization. Organizations are obligated to maintain an audit trail, have things like application security, secure development lifestyle or life cycle process, asset disposal and management. Also obligated to conduct periodic risk assessments to evaluate your threat environment and your security controls and how they match up to that threat environment. Other controls like encryption and data security.
And if I may, Shea, just kind of jump in for a second so you can catch your breath. You know, what I will kind of say to the audience is that, and this really goes back to what Glenn was saying earlier, that we're seeing this more global trend, right? This global trend in the Biden administration, particularly to shift the burden from, you know, the government trying to regulate entities and government trying to take care of itself, to trying to get the private sector to carry, quote unquote, their fair share of the burden to protect the American people. And, you know, just to kind of do a quick side story here, you know, I think many of us remember the Colonial Pipeline attack. And that occurred, I want to say like July 2021, something like that, don't quote me. And that was a huge ransomware attack where the pipeline that carried most of the oil from Texas to the East Coast, it stopped production of gas to the East Coast. And so what happened is many of us were in these long gas lines, and it woke up the everyday American that these cybersecurity issues really are a national security problem, and it can affect the everyday American. And the Biden administration quickly responded. They responded by, in 7 days, setting forth this executive order. And the executive order was very focused on, we as the government need to take charge, and we need to set the example for the private sector of how to implement the appropriate security controls, which Shea is discussing here. Now, fast forward a year and a half after that, we had the war in Ukraine, right? Where for the first time, a nation state, and this is the Marine coming at me, a nation state leveraged cybersecurity as a way, cybersecurity attacks to soften the Ukrainian targets is part of their follow-on war operations. And the Biden administration recognized from there that, hey, it's not about we as the government need to set the example. We need the American people to take charge and implement these types of proactive measures. And so President Biden shortly thereafter gave this incredible speech. And what he said in there is that, and I'm trying to quote here, that it's your patriotic duty to implement these types of security measures as a way to mitigate the risk of the negative effects of cybersecurity on the American people. And so what we've seen, and exactly what Glenn said in this last slide, is that we've seen just an explosion of regulators taking their existing, the confines of their existing authorities and trying to expand them to get the private sector, i.e. you, to implement these types of security measures, again, to protect the American people. And that trend, we're not going to go backwards. So just continue to go forward. And so you're going to see it in twofold. One, on these proactive measures, which Shea's is talking about now, and then which I'll talk about shortly after, is about the incident response and the information that we share with regulators so that the government can take a more proactive measure to protect all of us, protect our customers. So with that said, Shea, I will shift it back over to you to talk to us more about these proactive measures.
Yeah, absolutely. So I pretty much covered this slide. We can move to the next one. And I think I've got my allergies under control. I apologize, everybody. Of course, it happens at the worst time. Can move to the next slide. So as Glenn mentioned earlier, this regulation has been very actively enforced by the Department of Financial Services. And so we've just provided some recent examples of enforcement actions. This is certainly not an inclusive list, but it's some of the more recent examples. And some of these, and you'll see common themes with respect to the violations that the Department of Financial Services found at these various organizations. For example, a lot of these organizations failed to implement appropriate access controls, in particular multi-factor authentication. We're seeing multi-factor authentication as a de facto control that's required for reasonableness. And of course, the New York Department of Financial Services cybersecurity regulations basically require multi-factor authentication. Now, the previous version of the regs left a little bit of wiggle room if you could have a different compensating control that would be equally strong as multi-factor authentication. Now we're going to see that as a requirement across the board, except for certain smaller financial institutions that qualify for limited exemptions. So for example, OneMain failed to implement appropriate user access controls, including privileged access controls. The iMed Vision also failed to implement multi-factor authentication. So did Carnival Cruise Lines. Many of these organizations failed to have appropriate or reasonably tailored cybersecurity policies and procedures. For example, Bitflyer failed to implement appropriate policies and procedures. They were using the policies and procedures that were designed from their former parent company that weren't tailored to their organization. They did not, some of them were templates that the department could obviously tell were templates. Some of them contained references to departments that didn't exist in the organization. And so these are the kinds of things that if your policies aren't fit to purpose, if you don't have the technical security controls in place that are required, and also, again, if you don't have that multi-factor authentication, that's going to be a red flag for the Department of Financial Services. And of course, if any of your failure of controls leads to a cybersecurity incident, that's going to almost certainly trigger a fine for you, as it did for example, Carnival Cruises, which they failed to implement multi-factor authentication. They eventually had four security incidents, and one of them was a ransomware incident. High probability that multi-factor authentication could have prevented at least some of those security incidents. So that's going to be fodder for an enforcement action for sure. We can move to the next slide now. Okay, so we also want to talk to you about, what's new now in these regulations. As you probably already know, parts 200 and 500 already required the appointment of a CISO, but the new regulations provide a little bit of color with respect to what is required for an individual who's going to satisfy that CISO position. And the regs specify that CISOs have to be qualified for that position. Seems like a no-brainer, right? They must be in their job description responsible for overseeing that cybersecurity program and implementing it, but also with respect to enforcing policy throughout the organization. So they have to have some authority with respect to that cybersecurity program too, in implementing accountability and pushing that down in the organization. They also have to have authority to direct sufficient resources toward that cybersecurity program. And so this is kind of interesting, right? In that the CISO has to have certain budgetary autonomy in their position as well, which I think may be a little bit of a change for certain organizations where the CISO may have to ultimately ask for those resources. This kind of begs the question of whether they have to have a certain budget pre-allocated to make sure that they can implement their cybersecurity program and direct the personnel effectively. And that CISO is also going to be obligated to report up the chain regarding material cybersecurity issues to the senior governing body, which is a new defined term in the regulations. That senior governing body is defined as the board of directors or a committee of the board that is responsible for oversight with respect to the cybersecurity program. They have to have sufficient understanding of cybersecurity to conduct that oversight, and they have to also direct executive management or their designees to develop that cybersecurity program appropriately. So you'll see here and in other regulations additional obligations placed on executives and senior management, the boards of directors, for implementing and overseeing the cybersecurity program. This is another trend, like Ericka was talking about recently, that we see continuing to develop in the area of cybersecurity. And then executive management is going to be responsible for certifying compliance with the regulations along with the CISO. Now, we've seen some cybersecurity enforcement actions by other regulators, for example, the FTC, holding senior executives, the CISOs and CEOs accountable for cybersecurity violations when they're particularly egregious. And these certifications give the Department of Financial Services a hook to hold those senior executives accountable if there are egregious violations. So that's something to keep in mind, particularly for CISOs and the highest ranking executives, as the regulations kind of put it. We can move to the next slide. Additionally, the regulations are going to require some enhancements of the security controls. As I mentioned, the previous version of the regulations did give some wiggle room with respect to enforcement of multi-factor authentication for a similarly strong security control, whereas now multi-factor authentication is going to be required for access to all company covered entity information systems and non-public information, and so that's a little bit of a change there. Also, privileged accounts have to have certain controls. They may only be used to perform privileged functions, and the number and functions of those particular accounts has to be managed by the organization to be tailored and role-based, because we see in various security incidents that threat actors are always looking for those privileged accounts so they can elevate their access and further deploy, for example, ransomware, gain access to sensitive information, those kinds of things. And so the Department of Financial Services has honed in on those privileged accounts, and organizations are going to have to make sure that they review those accounts, for example, and ensure that they're role-based and that users are only permitted to use privileged accounts for those privileged functions. Additional security controls, new control requirements will be automated vulnerability scanning with manual reviews for systems that aren't covered by the automated scans. Additional malware protections, for example, endpoint detection and response, or what they call XDR these days. Additional email monitoring and filtering will be required. New policy requirements as well. Additional asset controls, for example, hardware and software inventories, device management and disposal. And also, interestingly, while the previous regulations did require training of personnel, the new regulations, or as amended, they will require, in particular, training, social engineering training, which is very important because we often see that the human element is the weakest link in the chain. And so that's an interesting and notable change in the amended regulations. We can move to the next slide. Next slide, please.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Shea. So one interesting aspect of the amendments is the creation of a new class of covered entities that are defined as Class A companies. So these are larger companies that are going to have to comply with additional somewhat onerous requirements that smaller entities won't have to comply with. So a Class A company is defined as a covered entity with at least $20 million in gross annual revenue in each of the 2 fiscal years. So not averaged over, but each of the last 2 fiscal years, from operations of the entity and its affiliates in New York State. So $20 million of New York generated revenue for the entity and its affiliates. And I'll talk about the affiliate aspect in a second. So they have to do that, and either they have to have over 2,000 employees globally, doesn't have to be in New York, average over the last 2 fiscal years, including, again, employees of the covered entities affiliates, either that or $1 billion in gross annual global revenue, not in New York, but globally, in each of the last 2 fiscal years from all business operations of the covered entity and its affiliates. So it's $20 million in New York and either 2,000 employees globally or $1 billion in gross annual global revenue. Again, as I mentioned, that's including affiliates. So, but interesting, and again, we're not highlighting too many of the differences between the November draft of these amendments and the June one, but this was interesting that they added in this latest draft a clarification that affiliates of a covered entity are only included if they share information systems, cybersecurity resources, or all or any part of a cybersecurity program with the covered entity in question. And so that could be a material clarification for many entities that maybe the overall organization only has a few covered entities. And so, you need to look at whether that covered entity is a Class A company or not, and whether they have to add the employees or revenue of the affiliates. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that's interpreted, though, right? Because if the DFS deems all entities within a large, complex organization to share elements of a cybersecurity program, for example, because there's an overarching information security policy that governs all of them, that clarification is not going to be too helpful, right? And many organizations do have a, sort of parent company level information security policy that, purports to govern all of its affiliates. If that's enough to treat all of those organizations as affiliates, then again, that's that clarification is not going to be very helpful. Likewise, if they deem all entities within a large complex organization to share cybersecurity resources, because the organization has an overall CISO at the top parent level, then again, that's going to, if that's enough, because there's one CISO, maybe there's many CISOs, but there's one at the top. If that's enough to treat everybody as affiliates, then again, you're not going to see much benefit from that clarification. The next slide, please. Yeah, there we go. So I will also say that this latest draft of the amendments did remove some additional obligations that had been placed on Class A companies in the November draft. So that's a win for larger organizations. And they're really, I mean, the unique requirements for Class A companies really come down to a handful. First, Class A companies will be required to conduct an annual independent audit of its cybersecurity program. And the definition, a new definition in these amendments for independent audit does make it clear that you can have that audit be done by either an internal or external auditor, as long as the auditor is free to make decisions that aren't influenced by the covered entities management. So, I mean, I think it's a modest win and allowing for internal auditors to perform that audit. Class A companies must also implement an endpoint detection and response solution so that it can monitor anomalous activity, including lateral movement, and a solution that centralizes logging and security event alerting. The regs do give the CISO the latitude to approve the use of reasonably equivalent or more secure compensating controls instead of those endpoint detection and response solutions or event logging and monitoring solutions. But clearly the expectation or the preferred approach is for those specified solutions. The Class A companies also finally have to monitor privileged access activity and implement either a privileged access management solution, both a privileged access management solution and an automated way to block commonly used passwords for all accounts on information systems owned or controlled by the entity and wherever feasible for all other accounts. So as I think was alluded to earlier, those privileged access accounts are really what the threat actors are after. And so, the regs appropriately focus some attention on managing access to those accounts. And so that's why you see those. Next slide, please.
Okay, I think that's my cue. Well, good afternoon, good morning again, everybody. My name is Ericka Johnson, and I'm going to really start talking about kind of the back end, right? When you do have an incident, what are these new rules proposed to require you to do? And I will say, typically, when you're talking with me, something's broken, right? Cyber events happen, so typically we try to help you as much as possible, make the process as seamless as possible. So today, I hope to share some nuggets of information to kind of make this, hopefully, unfortunately, you'll never have to be there situation, make it as easy as possible for you. So really kind of just to slow down for a second and kind of level set here. Everything that Shea and Glenn just talked about, it is so important that we take this seriously and we do implement, because my job becomes so much easier when organizations have taken the appropriate measures to mitigate the risk of a cyber attack, because regulators understand that, we're doing our best. If an organization does everything they can, they follow the law, they take the appropriate measures, it still happens. Shea mentioned, it's the human element. There's the weakest link. You have a really motivated employee who just wants to open up every attachment and read every email and classify every email. And next thing you know, you've got a ransomware attack going because they were the weakest link, allowing that malicious code into your environment. So suffice it to say, if you do the work that Shea and Glenn discussed, it becomes so much easier. All right, so let's talk about incident response. What do these new regulations require? So the first thing that I find very interesting is that it sets forth 2 situations in which you need to notify DFS about a cyber event. Now, generally, a cyber event is defined as some type of attempt to get into your environment, or actually getting into your environment, whether it's successful or not, where a threat actor is attempting to disrupt or misuse your information. And so right now, as the laws stand, it provides 2 very existing broad categories in which you need to notify DFS. And so those 2 broad categories, as they stand now, are when you have some type of cyber event where you're going to need to notify some type of government or regulatory agency. So in the United States, every state has its own data breach notification law. So that's a good example. If you've got to notify the state AG's office, you're going to need to notify DFS. The other kind of very broad category is that if you had some type of cyber event that materially harms your organization, I'm overgeneralizing, but what's important and what I found very interesting about these new potential buckets for having to notify DFS is that we already have very broad categories which kind of captures most of these cybersecurity incidents already. And so let's talk through what, kind of reading the tea leaves, what these 2 additional notice requirements are. So the first additional notification requirement is a cybersecurity event where an unauthorized user, a threat actor, has gained access to a privileged account. And Shea did a great job already talking about what is a privileged account. It's basically what we use in the cyber incident response field as God's keys, right? It allows you to get into any account. It allows you to change security settings. Once a threat actor has access to this privileged account, they will move laterally within your environment, find your sensitive information, and try to either deploy malware or exfiltrate your data as part of a double extortion scheme. And so reading the tea leaves, what I think about this first additional notice requirement is that regulators, they know if your privileged account has been stolen, some internal control has broken down. And so as you're typically likely going to have to go online and fill out some form to notify DFS, I suspect that there's going to have to be a box you're going to have to check that says privilege account compromised. And as I'll talk through, a DFS will go in and want to understand how that occurred, what internal control broke down, because they're trying to make sure and assess, as you're certifying that you have these internal controls, whether or not they are in fact did exist. And so I thought that was very interesting as an expansive requirement. The next requirement is a cybersecurity event that results in the deployment of ransomware that materially affects your organization. So threat actor gets in, deploys malicious code, you're locked out, and you can no longer operate. Again, this is something typically that would have been captured in one of the 2 existing notice requirements. But as I'll talk about further in this presentation, we really see the Biden administration and regulators really wanting to get out ahead and collect as much information, particularly about ransomware attacks, because it's part of their more of the proactive nature to try to go after these threat actors and protect the American people. And I'll talk about the kind of things, that the information they want to collect from that, as a proactive measure to mitigate these cyber attacks for other organizations. So those are the 2 notice requirements. And if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat. I love to talk about this stuff. The next thing that changes is they're clarifying in the definition of a cyber event in which you have to notify. It's not just you, the covered entity, it's also your affiliates, your third-party service providers. So I know many of you perhaps on this call have heard of the move it, transfer vulnerability. We're working a number of those matters right now. We're seeing those are a result of third parties moving your customers' data and it being compromised. And so what DFS is clarifying here is that if you have a cyber event, it's not just an event that happened to you, it's more broadly your affiliates and your third parties, really just trying to expand those authorities, as we mentioned earlier today, that is the trend that we're to see, and then frankly the trend we're going to continue to see. So expanding those authorities. Next slide, please. So the next thing that, again, it's something that we're already doing, but it really is interesting that they want to codify this. So first is that we have an ongoing now obligation to implement and supplement our notice. Now, right now we have to notify DFS within 72 hours, and typically within 72 hours, you really don't know what's up or what's down. And what this is saying is that you have an ongoing obligation to tell us what information was impacted, how did the threat actor get in, have you met your notification obligations to individuals. Again, these are things we were typically doing beforehand as a way to get in front of the narrative and show regulators that we were responding appropriately, but now it's codifying saying, those who were trying to hide before, you cannot no longer hide, you do need to keep us updated. And then there's additional requirement that if DFS asks you for information, you need to promptly respond. Now, in our experience, DFS is very proactive. They will get on a call with you, they'll bring their own technical team in, they'll sit down with you, they'll want to talk to you about the policies and procedures, they'll want to know what technical controls you had in place. Did you have those technical controls that should have mitigated this cyber incident? They really get in the weeds, and this is just codifying that, yes, you do need to talk to us and you do need to answer our questions. Next slide, please. Now, this kind of goes to what I was talking about earlier. Why is DFS telling us we need to notify specifically of a ransomware event? We would have needed to notify them anyway. Again, this really goes to what we see with regulators is an expanded push to try to get as much information from private companies so that they can help mitigate these for other organizations. And so one thing, and this is actually almost taken out of the chapter of the Critical Infrastructure Act, which was required there. Almost verbatim, the requirement is within 24 hours. Now you need to notify DFS if you've made an extortion payment, so ransomware attack, you're paying the threat actor to get the decryption key so that you can get your data unlocked and get back online and become operational. Now you need to notify DFS within 24 hours. Now this is very interesting. Within 30 days, now you're required to provide a description of why did you pay the threat actor. So a written description of the reason, what alternate payment what alternate things did you think about considering? And then more importantly, what diligence did you do to ensure that you are complying with all laws in paying that ransom? So the one kind of big keystone law is, we can't pay individuals who are on the OFAC's, designated persons list. And so again, this is stuff we were doing anyway. We were doing our due diligence. We're writing these internal memos. Now DFS wants to see it. And really, I think, reading the tea leaves, it's because they're trying to be more proactive. So by way of an example, what we're seeing more and more is our clients are finding about incidents from Department of Homeland Security or other three-letter agencies. They're getting notified proactively, and it's because the Biden administration is taking a much more proactive approach to fight cybersecurity in the private sector. And we think this is just another example of DFS trying to get the appropriate information about these threat actors so that they can help mitigate the risk for other financial institutions. Okay, last slide. Next slide, please. All right, so who is going to be the unfortunate recipient of the first enforcement action? I mean, I really think you just kind of look to traditional regulatory enforcement. It's going to be someone who's blatantly violated. So for example, what Shea was mentioning, someone who doesn't implement multi-factor authentication. One thing we see a lot are we've got just tons of privileged accounts that are not used, that are continuing to just be hanging out in the organization. That's a good example of us not doing our due diligence on our privileged accounts. And it's going to be strong public appeal. So it's going to be some type of organization that had a massive breach of customer information that's going to negatively affect customers. So they're really going to want something strong public appeal. We're here to help and protect the American customer. And so that's something that likely we're going to see. Third, it's going to want to send a message about their priorities. Reading the tea leaves, for example, needing to notify about privileged accounts, for me, I would say that's something I really need to focus on, making sure we're cleaning that up, because whatever they choose, it's what they want to send a priority for other organizations to look to and say, oh, we need to make sure we do that. And then another thing that we've seen is if there are multiple organizations having the same issues, they might issue some type of enforcement action for multiple organizations at a time. perhaps who have all had this one issue, again, to set their priorities for other similarly situated organizations. And so we all don't want to be the first enforcement action. And so really, our takeaway today is really just start implementing those proactive measures, because if you do experience a cyber incident, you're in a much better place with regulators. Next slide.
So some of the most significant impacts here of the regulations we've already touched upon in prior slides, but we wanted to highlight them here because they're really important, and we also see them throughout other regulations and enforcement actions as well. There's the previously mentioned emphasis on leadership responsibility and oversight. Boards of directors, executive management, CISOs, they're not going to be able to hide behind organization level responsibility. Probably more regulators will get into the game of sanctioning individuals explicitly so that the enforcement action follows the individual after they leave an organization, particularly in the event of egregious violations like covering up security incidents and things like that. Additionally, this is a common thread through various regulations, including the new SEC rules that were just finalized. The importance of cybersecurity risk assessments. So organizations will need to periodically review their security controls, put them up against their threat profile, and determine whether those security controls are not only appropriate to satisfy the requirements of the regulations, but also appropriate to their the size, scope, complexity of their organization and their threat profile. Additionally, we see enhanced vulnerability management. So whether it's the requirements to do periodic vulnerability scans, requirements for penetration testing, requirements for patch management and things like that. These regulations are really focused on ensuring that organizations are identifying vulnerabilities proactively and mitigating them based upon the risk that is presented of that vulnerability. So if it's a very high risk vulnerability, organizations are going to want to implement a patch or a fix within hours and not days, like 24 hours or something like that. And then lower priority vulnerabilities can be addressed on a more extended timeline, but should still be remediated expeditiously, for example. There is, again, now pretty much all DFS covered entities are going to be required to implement multi-factor authentication for all access, and then even those smaller entities that qualify for limited exemptions will need to implement multi-factor authentication for most access to covered entities, information systems, and covered information. And there's also the importance of malware management. Those EDR solutions and things like that, although they're only going to be technically required for Class A organizations, in reality, those are the kinds of security controls that the regulators are going to want to see to show that you're effectively monitoring your systems for those kind of threats, because they're the types that could really escalate quickly into those kinds of ransomware events that we see very frequently. There's also the emphasis on cybersecurity awareness. for both for your rank and file personnel within covered entities, and also for your IT and security teams. That includes that social engineering training, and additionally, we're going to see an emphasis on incident and disaster recovery and response, and testing those plans so that when and if you do experience that cybersecurity incident, your organization is prepared to manage that incident effectively, mitigate the negative effects, and provide notifications to appropriate individuals, regulators in the required timeframes. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Shea. I just want to quickly, because we're almost out of time, go through very quickly what you should think about doing now in response to these amendments. And I want to point out that I think a copy of this presentation is going to be circulated to attendees, and on the last substantive slide, we have a timeline of when these various provisions go into effect. It's not all at once, it's phased in. But one thing you should do is ensure that your senior governing body, that's the term used, that means a board for most companies, but it could be managing members for an LLC or limited partners for a partnership, but whatever your highest governing body is, has sufficient expertise and knowledge, or is advised by people with that knowledge to exercise effective oversight of cybersecurity risk management. So if you're a smaller organization with perhaps a smaller board, maybe you don't have anyone on the board that independently has that expertise and knowledge, and so it would be appropriate to then retain an advisor to educate, to help educate that body. The second thing is make sure you have adopted and implemented an incident response plan and a business continuity and disaster recovery plan that satisfy the requirements of the amended regulations. So you were already required to have an incident response plan, but there have been new requirements added to what that has to cover. And then the business continuity / disaster recovery plan is a new requirement. So you just want to make sure you're in compliance with those requirements. And then the last thing on the slide is, you want to make sure that you've retained a third party or identified appropriate internal resources that can perform the required pen testing and vulnerability scanning. Next slide. And maybe we just skip the questions to go. Can you, yeah, one more, there we go. Ericka?
Yeah, so quickly, our questions were really around who's got cyber insurance and who's actually thought through, in the event of an incident, who's gonna be your outside counsel and who's gonna be your IT retained firm. Oftentimes, we're walking in to bet the company cybersecurity incidents, and you've got to make the decision within 12 to 24 hours who's going to be your team to help carry you through this storm. And we certainly recommend knowing who that team is going to be ahead of time, working with your cyber insurance to know who interview, to select that people. Know a huge part of our practice is cleaning up breaches from counsels that don't know what they're doing. And so a recommendation is know who your team is ahead of time. That's going to help manage you through this incident. And also, last thing is just be prepared. Have documentary evidence of all the great things you're doing to implement the appropriate security measures, because DFS will ask for those. They will ask for your policies and procedures. They'll want to know what your internal controls are. They'll sit down, talk with their technical team. And if you don't have those ready to go and prepared, like I said, it makes all of our jobs a lot harder, and we want to see you succeed. So just think about being prepared for that. Next slide.
Yeah, and this is just provided for informational purposes only. I do want to address a couple of questions if we have time, maybe just one question that have come in from the audience. One is, how will these new requirements impact out-of-state banks and other financial institutions that have branches in New York? And the answer to that question is, the amended regulations will apply to any entity that's operating under or is required to operate under an NYDFS license. So if you're a license holder or you're required to be a license holder, then they will apply to you. and so you can just look and see whether you're required to be licensed under a number of various regulations covering various organizations within the financial services industry sector. But also, as a practical matter, if you're a service provider to a company that is an organization that is a license holder, then you really need to be also working towards compliance with the regulations, because you're going to expect that your customers are going to flow these requirements down to you contractually. Maybe not every single one of them, but the core requirements that apply to all covered entities, you can expect those to be a contractual requirement in your next update or renewal of your agreement, or maybe even before then. So it sort of behooves you, if you play in the space, even if you're not required to hold a license, if you are providing services to the license holder, you really need to be aware of these requirements and work toward complying with them. So I think that was it. We really, again, thank Lexology for allowing us to come and speak to you today, and thanks for taking your time to hear about these topics. Thanks, everybody.